the voice of the resistance. With political tensions rising worldwide as well as regionally, there is a lot at stake on every election. And in that context, both the electoral and presidential elections taking place in Argentina on 2023 are crucial for the future of the South American nation, as well as the subcontinent as a whole. One of South America's most prolific sociology authors, Atilio Boron, is a reference across the continent. His latest book, The Sorcerer of the Tribe, dissects liberalism in Latin America. We reach out to him to talk about Argentinian and South American politics.
Atilio Boron, mucho gusto. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos.
Atilio Boron, thank you very much for joining us. After what happened in Argentina with former President, now Vice President Cristina de Kirchner, was sentenced to 6 years in jail, but more importantly, she was banned from any public post a year before the elections, and with precedents like that of Brazil's Lula de Silva, as you see it, what do you think is happening?
¿Cómo lo ves tú? ¿Qué es lo que tú piensas que está pasando?
Mira, yo creo que la Argentina hoy en día, Oscar, y puede parecer una...
Oscar, I believe that Argentina today, and this may appear to be a strong statement, is rapidly moving towards a judicial-media dictatorship. This can be verified by any political scientist. He doesn't need to be from the left or a critical thinker. You simply have a handcuffed government. Absolutely. Any decision that is taken immediately provokes judicial protection, or a precautionary measure, or even a declaration of unconstitutionality by the Supreme Court, or by the judges that interfere, not only in the administrative management of the state under the charge of the executive branch, but also, for example, in the legislative branch, ruling against decisions made by senators about how they want to be organized. So we are really in a very complicated moment, which also has mafia characteristics, because this would be, let's say, not just an official case, rather it has been verified through some chats that were leaked to the press and through some operations that could not be silenced. Large business groups, particularly Grupo Clarín, hosted a seminar trip to Patagonia to a ranch owned by a British millionaire named John Lewis. All expenses were paid for a group of judges, group of prosecutors, some journalists, and even the Minister of Security of the autonomous city of Buenos Aires, who were brought in on a charter plane. This speaks of an absolutely irregular situation, at odds with the procedural code, with the mandates of the Constitution, and with the laws, and yet all this continues its course, this media judicial dictatorship. And I emphasize the media part over the judiciary, because the role of the powerful media groups that we have in Latin America, and I would say in general throughout the world, is essential to prepare the climate. This eventually means that corrupt judges and prosecutors without evidence decided to sentence Cristina de Kirchner to 12 years in prison, which was later reduced in a final decision to 6 years. But what didn't change was her lifelong ban from participating in political life, and I underline this, to convict without evidence. It is exactly the same thing that happened in another case. As you will remember, and as the audience will remember, the trial against the current president of Brazil, Lula da Silva. And in that case, a Curitiba judge, Sergio Moro, sentenced Lula and said textually in the sentence, "I have no proof that this man has committed a crime, but I am convinced that he has committed it." In other words, this implies a 200 or 250-year regression in legal history where, following the French Revolution, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Citizens' Rights, the issue of due process, and the principle of innocence until proven otherwise were finally established. Well, not anymore in today's Latin America. What I'm telling you about Cristina and Lula, we can extend to what happened with Rafael Correa, Mel Zelaya, Fernando Lugo, and Evo Morales. In short, it's all a continental strategy, which, along with some authors like Estela Coloni, Paula Klatsko, and Fernando Bueno Bad, to mention a few that come to mind, we have appropriately baptized as Plan Condor 2. Plan Condor 1 was simply the kidnapping, torture, murder, and disappearance of popular militants. Plan Condor 2 appeals to media terrorism and lawfare to remove popular leaders from the political game who are annoying to the oligarchic interests of the empire.
I have worked a lot reporting on the border. I have done several series on the theme of the border. The reason why they really do not want these Latinos here is because the Republican Party realized that they are not going to be able to win any more elections. So the lesson of all of this is that more and more the right is running out of electoral possibilities because it alienates poor people, gay people, and people of other races, and progressives. So much so that at the end of the day, the voters for the other party are many more.
Así es. No,
That's right.
claramente,
No, of course, mind you, Oscar, all of this also has to do with the rise of neofascism, xenophobic racist attitudes, and, well, homophobic misogynists in the world. Here we are in the presence of a very worrying phenomenon, the radicalization towards fascism of the right, a process that some authors, such as Nico Palances, masterfully glimpsed in a text from the late 1970s. He raised the possibility that this moderate right, that is, that of capitalism, could bet on democracy in a context of economic growth, economic stability, zero inflation, etc. But to the extent that these conditions deteriorated, the process of radicalization towards fascism on the right was going to be unstoppable. And unfortunately, half a century later, the predictions that Polanza made in a book called Fascism and Dictatorship are being fulfilled to the letter. When one looks at the map of the European governments, where a fascist or fascitoid right wing directly governs or forms part of the cabinet, we are talking about practically half of Europe. In other words, a phenomenon not seen since the middle of the interwar period, when fascist governments and regimes clearly rose to prominence. That eventually stopped, but today it is advancing with unfurled sails, and it is a danger to all. And we are also seeing it in some Latin American countries, notably Brazil, where a man like Bolsonaro is a racist, fascist, militarist, xenophobe, etc. In the presidential election, he received nearly 58 million votes, finishing less than 2 points behind Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva. We are talking about a phenomenon of enormous gravity, and I think that you said it very well earlier as it appeared in your investigations on the subject of the border.
sobre el tema de la frontera.
Precisely that reminds me of what we see now in Peru, where for two administrations the populist right, in this case Keiko Fujimori, has refused to accept her defeat. The second time around she even alleged that there was fraud, and now for the second consecutive time a president has been, in a certain way, deposed, although it was obviously President Castillo who made the serious mistake of taking the bait that was presented to him. But regardless of the legality of it all, it is a clear example of a power struggle. On the one hand, you have very poor people, and on the other hand, you have big capital. And we are now experiencing that, when the president has been removed in Peru, and now we can see, like in this video, an example of what you just described. A Plan Condor 2.0. Where the military brutalized the population. Looks like it's back.
Sí, evidentemente, mira, es que el tema del...
Yes, of course. Look, there has been a remarkable resurgence of the native people's struggle in recent times. I was speaking at a conference the other day when I briefly discussed my background as a political scientist and sociologist in the 1960s. Well, with the exception of a few courses given in Mexico at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, native peoples related themes were entirely absent from higher education in Latin America. Nothing more than that, and this clearly highlighted the nature, significance, and gravitas of Mexico's indigenous peoples because that country has a vibrant indigenous culture, as shown in Mexican murals, for example. However, you could pursue a sociology course or a bachelor's degree, a postgraduate degree, or a doctorate, and there was not going to be a text or a study on the subject of the native population in Latin America. That ended with the famous progressive cycle, which basically started at the beginning of 1999 with the triumph of Chavez and the assumption of the presidency of Venezuela by Commander Hugo Chavez, Bolivarianism, and everything that was involved with that new political conception, which made indigenous people more visible. Well, it caused the reaction of some people who say, no, 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 we have nothing to do with them. Yes, we are white, and our work is better. In the worst case, we are mestizos, but we have nothing to do with indigenous people. Do not forget the Catholic Church took half a century after the conquest to consider these native peoples as human beings. And I tell you, that was a church that had some of the most important intellectuals at the time. The great exception was Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, but Bartolomé de las Casas had to put up a huge fight with all the power of the hierarchy and the ecclesiastical intelligentsia, which denied this human condition to the original peoples. If you go to one of our countries today where these indigenous populations are very strong, consider the following examples: Guatemala, Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador, then you will notice that the attitude of the oligarchy is going to be very different. There's an Indian, let's say, who is considered an inferior being and who does not deserve to enjoy any of the attributes that the law guarantees to ordinary citizens. So this seems to me to be an enormously serious issue. Look at, for example, one of the issues that caused the defeat in the plebiscite regarding a possible Chilean constitutional reform. Do you remember? The unfortunate election of September 4 was a constitutional project that implied very significant advances and very important legal empowerment for indigenous peoples, for women, for sexual minorities, and for the ethnic minority, gender, and marginal sectors. But one of the most contentious issues was the thesis that Chile was a multinational or plurinational country, which caused a very, very strong rejection. The dominant discourses completely tame, train, and brutalize even the most popular sectors of the Chilean population through the absolute control that the right has. In the case of Chile, the media, that is, the print media, radio, and television. So the issue is of enormous seriousness and feeds all these attitudes that require certain work from the state and the progressive government that sometimes has not been carried out.
Del Estado y de los gobiernos progresistas que a veces no ha sido hecho.
I have covered indigenous uprisings several times now in Ecuador. They have an indigenous movement, the strongest, or one of the strongest, and the last time it was evident that President Guillermo Lasso tried to lower his foot and tried to turn into Pinochet to fight them. He kidnapped the indigenous leader, sent the army into the streets, but the indigenous simply closed the national territory, closed the roads, and demonstrated to President Lasso that they are in possession of the territory, no matter how much he throws a tantrum about it. They have a concrete form of control, don't they?
Sí, absolutamente. Yo creo que
Yes, absolutely. I believe that those countries, as you say, with such a high density of indigenous peoples, obviously have a power factor. Indigenous communities are an extraordinary power factor. And of course, further organization is required, as is thinking together with other sectors that are not necessarily part of the original people, so that they can somehow put together a majority coalition that can really prevail against the interests of this bloody banking oligarchy. And in the case of President Guillermo Lasso, an unhealthy toxic mix exists between neoliberalism and Opus Dei. The worst, the most retrograde that one can think of in political terms or philosophical terms is embodied in this figure. He also has violent traits, is subjecting the Ecuadorian people to untold suffering, and has also violated the state. I would tell you, Oscar, that I believe there is no similar example in all of Latin America where the process of violating the rule of law has gone as far as the case of Ecuador. In Argentina, we may struggle in this field, but for example, there has never been a situation where it has been declared that former President Jorge Glass should be released because his fundamental rights have been violated. A judge was directly removed from the case by a presidential decision. And when another judge declared the same thing about the case, they put him in jail. In other words, we are really talking about extreme situations that we have not seen before in Latin America. where the violation of what remained of independent and equitable justice has now become part of the scenario and of Latin America's current socio-political landscape.
Y el paisaje sociopolítico y actual en América Latina.
Mi última pregunta, volvemos a la Argentina.
For my last question, we return to Argentina, where we have Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who has obviously been left out of the competition without a chance by this verdict. And at the same time, on the other side, we have Milei, who is like a new contender who is surging. He's an emerging right-wing leader that is really surprising many. Is there something similar on the left, or among working-class representatives who can act as a counterweight to Milei? How do you see the elections?
Peso, ¿cómo le ves a las elecciones?
Mira, Milei es un fenómeno.
Javier Milei is absolutely a media phenomenon. He has a media genesis, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have a very strong social impact. Why? Because the government of Alberto Fernandez has been characterized by the lukewarmness with which it has approached some fundamental issues in terms of distributive policy, tax policy, combating poverty, and so on. And the sectors that are linked to the ruling party, a great coalition called Frente de Todos, made up of Peronism, Kirchnerism, variants of the Social Democratic Party, the left, the Communist Party, etc., have not been strong enough to make the government advance more radically in this approach. The left, on the other hand, is a small Trotskyist-inspired left wing that is cloistered in some small niches in Argentine society, but has no real mass gravitation, and its protests are protests that have no echo in society. This contrasts with the presence of a character like Milei, who was the character portrayed on Argentine television the most times, a runaway in the first place, throughout the year 2022. That's why I tell you that Milei is fundamentally a media construct. In terms of media exposures, the difference between Milei and the one that finished in second place is monumental. It is measured in hours, not minutes, throughout 2022. So they fill the media with a figure who says any amount of nonsense. It is a man who cannot withstand a public debate for 10 minutes, you know? I can tell that he has all the gestures typical of someone who wants to appear as a transgressor, as opposed to the system, when in reality the best way to characterize Milei is a jester of capitalism, a jester of imperialism, who performs a very important task for them. That is why the media, which knows how to play the masses, has given it so much importance. I personally believe that the effect that Milei is going to have is to pull more radical sectors from the center-right to the extreme right, those who were previously more cautious in their speech, politics, and gestures. Milei's gestures can only be compared to those of Hitler or Mussolini. If you look at his speech, the gestures, the face he puts on, the movement of his arms, the shouts, etc., they speak of someone who wants to emulate them. Like Hitler, Milei also wants to appear as opposed to capitalism, just as Mussolini did, when in reality they are servants of capitalism. I hope that this will not have a very strong impact on the next elections. I trust this coalition that is currently governing, which is known as a very, very watered-down left, as we call it, and in Peru, they call it the caviar left. I mean, I don't want to disqualify them, but I do want to talk about the extremely moderate, disproportionately moderate style that they have in the government of Alberto Fernandez, at a time when social reality demands much more radical, much stronger policies, not doing them open space for cheap demagogues like the character we're talking about.
Baratos como este personaje que me estaba hablando.